Hello, and welcome to the TechHub.training Excel Cash Flow Crunch Challenge. In this video, I'll be going through the challenge and showing you how I arrived at my solution. So the first thing that I like to do when I look at this transaction data is to make it easier. I want to make sure that there are some named ranges within this Excel sheet. So if you go to the Formulas tab up the top, you'll see that there's a thing called Name Manager. So right now you see that the name manager is blank, but a good way to, I guess, capture all of this data and let Excel name it for you is to just select the entire table, and from here you can click Create from Selection, or you can press Control-Shift F3. Once you click that, it'll ask you where you would like to create the names from. So from here, we can see that the default is top row left column. We don't have any headers in the left column. That left column is the date, so we can uncheck that box. And then when we click OK, if we go to the name manager now, we have these 5 named ranges here, and you can see that the range selected relates to the respective column header. So for that way, we can, when we type in a formula, we can directly call the column, so such as cash inflows, and it will call on that column so that we have the values that we need. So now that we have done that, we can move on to part 1 of the challenge, which is in the cash flow statement sheet. And for this part 1, we are trying to fill in the blanks here so that we can calculate the correct cash at the end of the year. And so here we already have a bunch of numbers, a bunch of formulas already pre-existing, so they should update as we go through the challenge. So for the entirety of the statement of cash flows section, I figured out that you could use just one formula and copy it down to complete the whole section. So I'll type that out for you and explain my thought process. So here we would like to know the cash flows for operating activities, and this is the same for the investing and the financing activities, but I'll just go ahead and show you using the accounts receivable section. And so we know that the cash flows for this accounts receivable category relates to the total of the cash inflows and the cash outflows, as we see from the transaction data before. So we would expect that cash inflows minus cash outflows will either give us a positive or a negative number. A positive number will indicate a cash inflow, so we're receiving cash, and a cash outflow would be resultant in a negative number, which means that we are paying cash out. So in order to calculate the accounts receivables cash flow, we can use what is called the SUMIFS function. And so the SUMIFS function, it adds the cells specified by a given set of conditions or criteria. So we can give it a summed range, and so we know that we are interested in the cash inflows. And for the criteria range, we know that we are interested in only getting those accounts receivables inflows. So we can put, for the criteria range, we just put description, because we know that that is where the different names, such as accounts receivable, purchase of supplies, rental income, that's where all those are located, are in the description column in the transaction data. And so we put description. And then for the criteria, we're only interested in those cells where accounts receivable is in the description. So we can just click the accounts receivable there, because we know that it's spelt the exact same way, or it's formatted the exact same way. And for a criteria, if we just put the cell B8, by default, it's what it's asking for that criteria is whether B8 is true. And so the default is asking whether the accounts receivable is equal to what is in the criteria range, which is description. So if accounts receivable is equal to accounts receivable, then that will be true. And so then that would be what passes through the SUMIFS function. Now this function will give us the total cash inflows for the accounts receivable section, but we're not interested in just the cash inflows. We want to know the total cash flow, or the cash inflows minus the cash outflows. So what we can do here is we can close the parentheses, and we can actually take this this function that we've just made, and we can copy it, and then minus, and then paste it in. And instead of cash inflows, we know that we're interested in the cash outflows. So we can put that in here, and then we can press enter, and that should give us our value. Now we can see that the total cash flow is ultimately positive for the accounts receivables for this year. And we can take this function and we can actually copy it down into the remaining sections, and that should give us our total net cash provided by operating activities. So from just looking at here, just to check, we can see that the purchases of supply, that's generally an output, as well as the rent payment and the salary payment. That makes sense because we are paying money, obviously, and so with rental income, we're receiving money, so it would make sense that is positive. For the purchases of supplies that we're also purchasing, we're spending cash, and so that it makes sense to also be negative. Now, as I mentioned before, this function still works in the same way for the investing and the financing activities. So we can just take any cell there and we can just copy it down ourselves into the investing section and also into the financing activities section as well. And that should give us our total cash at the end of the year, which is equal to $110,495. For part two, we have 3 questions that we're interested in looking into. These could have been questions that Jesse, our manager, gave to us, or they could just be general questions that we were intrigued by as we were looking through the transaction data. But to answer them, I will go through each function that I made and show you just my thought process for each one. Now, the first question is asking us for the total cost of the 3 smallest vehicle purchases within the transaction data or within that year. Now, straight off the bat, because we see that we're looking at purchases, I know that this is going to be a cash outflow. And so I know that the column that I'll probably be referring to is the cash outflows column. Now, to do this, I know that I will want these smallest 3 figures that are from purchase of vehicle entries. And Excel has a handy formula called small, which returns the smallest value within a data set. For example, it has here that it will return the 5th smallest number if you would like that, but we are interested in the 3 lowest numbers. Now, in the challenge, it mentions that arrays can be very helpful when doing this formula, and so I will show you how I do this with the array, and then I'll explain the array for those who aren't too familiar with arrays and how they work. Now, I begin the formula with a sum function because I know that I'll be trying to get the total cost. So I'll eventually want to be summing up those 3 costs. Then now that I have the sum function, I'll be interested in getting the smallest numbers. So the first thing I ask for is an array. Now for this array, I know that I want to give the data that is all the purchase of vehicles for the year. And so for that, I'm going to use an if statement, similar to the sum if statement that we used in the previous part. I will be using just an if statement, and in this sense, for my logical test, I'll be saying where I want description to be equal to that purchase vehicle cell. Now, if this is true, then I want to return the cash outflows value for that particular row, and if it is false, then I'll just put in a blank value. When I close off that parentheses and add a comma, now it wants me to ask for the value of k. Now, typically in a small function, the letter k is represented by the specific number or position that you want to retrieve from the small function. So usually you would ask for only one position. So you'd ask for either the last position or so for example, the first or the smallest position and then the second smallest, third smallest, etc. But in Excel, you can define a function using the curly braces. And so I would like the smallest, the second smallest, and the third smallest. And as I close that curly braces, Excel knows that this is an array. So as it goes throughout that formula, when it hits the array in the small section, it's going to actually go through 3 times and retrieve 3 separate numbers. Now as I close off the parentheses for that, and as I click enter, I'm giving the value, which is $2,429. Now we can verify this by going to the transactions data and putting some filters on the headers row. So if we go to data and click on the little filter here, we can go to our description. And if I just type in purchase here and deselect purchase of suppliers, so that purchase of vehicle, and then filter for only the purchase of vehicle, and we can see that we have quite a few values here that are outflows. And if I just sort this from smallest to largest, I know here are the 3 lowest. Now if I hover over those down the bottom corner here, I can see that the sum of that is in fact $2,429. Great, let me just clear the filter there. Now returning back to the cash flow statement and the second part. Similar to the small function, there is also another function called large, and that will be helpful with the next part as we tackle the 5 greatest losses from sale of shares. Now we know that the greatest losses are going to be outflows typically because we are losing money. And so as we look at the sale of shares, we know that the formula will be pretty similar to the one that we just made previously. So I'm actually going to go ahead and copy some of this formula. I know that we don't need the sum because we're looking for individual values. So if I can just copy this and escape out, and here I'll just paste that in. And instead I'm interested in large. Let me put an equal sign at the start just so it knows that it's a formula. And I'm interested in large. And then for the array, instead of B16, I'm interested in the sale of shares. So let me move that over to B18. Cash outflows looks good, if true. And instead of the smallest 3, I'm looking for the largest 5. So I can just add 4 and 5 in there. And then if I press enter, then I can get those 3 values. Now obviously there's a formatting area there. I can just go to home, click format painter, and then copy that over so it looks good. And here I have the 5 greatest losses from the sale of shares. Now one thing to note with this is that I'm looking at losses, and so I might want to make those negative, so I can just put a minus sign in there and it will update to have those in parentheses to suggest that they are losses. Now for the last question, this is going to be really similar to what we did in part 1. However, it requires a little bit of intuitive thinking. So the question is, how much in supplies were returned? So if we think about the purchase of supplies is typically an outflow of cash because we're paying someone. And so if we return the supply, then we're going to get a refund. And so we'll typically expect that to be a cash inflow. So this is going to be very similar to the equation that we did in the purchase of supplies over in part 1. And so we can use the SUMIFS function. And then the sum range, we want that to be cash inflows. Criteria, we can say we want it to be the description where the criteria is equal to the purchase of supplies. Close the parenthesis on that, press enter. Then I'm going to get $616. And that means that we've had $616 in returns of the supplies, or we've been refunded for $616 that year for supplies. I hope you've enjoyed this Excel challenge. It is my hope that you will begin to use more arrays within your formulas and throughout the work that you do. Arrays can be incredibly powerful. As you can see, we can change multiple formulas or multiple cells into just a single cell, or what is similar to a mega formula. As always, I'm interested to see if there are any different ways that you managed to tackle these challenges. Feel free to comment in the TechHub.training challenge. The link will be in the description below. And thank you for watching.